I love movies and good TV shows. And one of my favorite actors is Daniel Day-Lewis. And that means a few years ago, I was really, really sad to learn that Dan, as we know each other, he had announced he was retiring from acting. His range as an actor is really remarkable. A few weeks ago, Ellen and I watched the movie called A Room with a View, which came out in 1985. It's a wonderful, very subtle, and romantic English film in which Daniel Day-Lewis plays this wimpy, self absorbed jerk who justifiably loses the girl because he's such a dweeb. But only 5 years later, he starred as the hero Hawkeye in The Last of the Mohicans. The mere mention of Daniel Day-Lewis in Last of the Mohicans, that sends a lot of women, and plenty of men, into fits of hyperventilation. Ellen pretty much goes into a trance because in that film, he's handsome, rugged, heroic, fearless, noble, and completely ripped. It's really hard to believe it's the same actor. Anyway, in one of the most dramatic scenes in Last of the Mohicans, Hawkeye, played by Ellen, could you get the picture of Daniel Day-Lewis off?
No, you're still talking about it. Go ahead.
Well,
Can we just keep him up for a little bit longer? Come on.
yeah, I know, but all right. So anyway, Daniel Day-Lewis plays this Hawkeye character, right? And he must leave the love of his life behind. It takes place as they're both hiding behind a waterfall from their enemies who are fast approaching. They know that there's no escape and there is no time to. Oh, finally, I'm back on camera.
It's okay.
There's, well, I know you'd probably rather watch Daniel Day-Lewis too. Anyway, there's no escape. There's no time to lose in this scene. He knows that if they're found together, they'll both likely be killed. But if she's there alone, she'll only be kidnapped. Anyway, he has to leave without her. So in that very tense scene, he tells her, "Promise me you'll stay alive. I promise you. I will find you. I will find you." And then he disappears by leaping through the waterfall. It's really a breathtaking moment. And true to his word, overcoming incredible odds, he does find her and he rescues her. Just as importantly, she stays alive and she keeps her hope alive by believing in that promise that was made beneath the waterfall. That's Hollywood. But there's a reason we love stories like that. We need to believe in promises, as crazy as they may seem. We need hope, even in situations that look absolutely hopeless. Because promises keep us going. They keep us persevering through whatever we're going through. Even through the greatest fear and doubt, having a promise to hold on to is literally a lifeline. But it's also a normal reaction to be suspicious of promises, at least the promises that go beyond our personal experience or expectations. If a telemarketer calls you and promises that your investment of $1,000 in real estate in the middle of the desert in Utah will yield $100,000 within a year, you'd be perfectly right to suspect that it's a scam and you would hang up on them. But what if instead of a telemarketer, you got a call from a friend who was a savvy investor, or your financial advisor who's always made smart decisions for you? And what if they could provide verification that just beneath the desert was a vast deposit of valuable minerals? In that case, you just might be willing to part with $1,000. So we believe in promises when we can envision the outcome and, importantly, when we feel that we can trust the source. We're willing to risk our time and energy and even our money. We're willing to go to great lengths, even to sacrifice what might make rational sense for the chance to make that vision a reality. A promise is always a vision of what's possible, even if it seems unlikely. With a promise, we can achieve what seems impossible. Without a promise, what seems impossible would never be achievable. The thing is, we already know that's true about ourselves. We want to believe in promises because we know that with a promise, we can see beyond our own limitations. Without a promise, we're resigned to staying locked inside of our self-imposed limitations, usually without ever realizing they're self-imposed. We understand life as just being the way things are. In that kind of existence, life can feel more like a cycle of sameness. Now, there can be a lot of comfort in that. There is nothing wrong with having a sense of familiarity and security. And sometimes we can even believe that that's what our faith is all about, and how we practice our faith should be about. That it's unchanging, that it's dependable. Going to church can represent stability and continuity in all of the crazy stuff that the world is throwing at us constantly. A calm in the storm. I've heard that phrase applied to church a lot. But the thing that we can lose sight of when it comes to faith and how we express it is that even though we build great structures to gather in and we develop traditions that feel sacred and we can find great comfort in everything that's familiar, like our favorite hymns and liturgies and all the rituals we've come to know, is the truth that there's hardly anything in the Bible about keeping things the way they are or relying on the things that we've built up around ourselves. Instead, what we hear consistently throughout Scripture is to do something new. Think about it. People in the Bible are always going about their business as usual, when they suddenly hear a voice or they see a weird sign of some kind, like a burning bush, and they're called to stop what they've been doing and go do something kind of crazy. You want us to do what? It happens over and over. God says, I know you're really into this certain way of being, but in order to fulfill my vision of love for you and for all of humanity, I need you to trust and to pursue a promise, a new way of being. So it's ironic. We develop ways of being, and we build churches, and we dedicate stained glass windows, and we create traditions, and we invest an enormous amount of emotional energy in those things. They matter to us because they come to represent our very identity as people of faith. And that's just human nature. And none of that is wrong, as long as those things never become the whole point. Nothing's wrong with tradition, as long as preserving tradition doesn't become an object of worship in itself. Because God, our object of worship, tells us through Scripture very clearly not to place our trust in our belief in any things, but to believe and to follow a promise. When the prophet Jeremiah spoke on behalf of God, God's people were going through a very turbulent and anxious time. It was during the final days of the kingdom of Judah. Politically, they were losing stability, and their country was being taken over by the mighty Babylonian Empire. The very center of their religious universe, the temple, would soon be destroyed. That building was where the presence of God was said to dwell. Their faith leaders and traditions and all the things they held as their most sacred objects would be carted off or destroyed. Everything they believed that held their identity together and gave them meaning and purpose would be gone. So understandably, hope was in short supply. In the midst of that calamity, Jeremiah's word to the people was a promise, a new covenant. A covenant itself is a promise, but rather than this promise being etched into stone on any kind of material object, this one would be written on their hearts. And that was an important distinction. It was an affirmation that the objects that we so often hold sacred are ultimately just objects. They don't contain sacredness itself. That holiness we carry within us right here in our hearts. The promise is not a material item that can be seen or touched. No, it's at the center of who we are. And for the people hearing those words, that was a huge change in how they understood their relationship with God and with each other. From that point on, their faith wasn't tethered to a thing or to a place, but to a promise they all carried within them. Like a lot of those ancient people, we don't often appreciate that a promise, it's like being on a journey. It's a pathway we hold inside and we follow toward a goal. And in life, the path that we're on, guided by a promise in our heart, is just as important as the goal itself. The journey is how we're spending our time and our energy and resources as we make that promise real. That's why people of faith have often been called people of the promise, because we're travelers, we're dreamers. We hope and we envision because of the promise that's written on our hearts. And in the doing of all that, that's when we're truly living. So it's worth asking, what's the promise we seek? What are we envisioning? What are we hoping for? Are we being true to what we carry on our hearts? Maybe I'm asking you, are you pursuing your dreams? And if not, why not? Are you living in hope today? And if not, why not? Have you recognized and affirmed the promise that's written on your heart? Believe me, it's there. So are you on that journey? That's important to stop and ask yourself from time to time, but let me talk a little bit about how we ask those questions collectively as a church. We have to ask those questions because they get at the core of why we exist as a group in the first place. Are we here to preserve things as they are or as they have been? Or are we on a journey of promise? I've been asked a lot in recent weeks what's going to happen when Salem reopens. What will the church be like? We still don't know when that will be. It'll be whenever more of us get vaccinated and infection rates decline and state and local officials decide that it's safe for large numbers of people to begin gathering indoors again. Let's hope that that'll be sometime this summer. In the meantime, we're getting ready for that at Salem, even as we'll continue doing this live stream service. So, what it'll look like is this. We'll have in-person church and virtual church. You'll get to decide on Sundays if you get dressed and show up or if you'll stay home in your jammies. And if you don't live around here, you can wear whatever you want when you watch online. We'll never know. A lot of the questions I get about reopening seem to center around kind of the same thing. Will things be the same in a more material sense? Will we be back to normal? What will worship look like? Because admittedly, this live stream service doesn't look much like a normal in-person service, does it? Well, after everything we've been through this past year, I know we all yearn for normal. I do. I am beyond tired of Zoom meetings as our only option. Being able to see people in person is something I will never again take for granted. But if there's one thing I hope we've learned on this weird journey of a pandemic, it's the truth that what we carry in our hearts, our hope, our faith, the promise that we will make it through, that matters more than any material thing or any way of being. I hope we've learned that we can be the church in ways that none of us ever thought was possible before. It's true, we had to put on hold the very important habit of gathering in person, and that change in itself feels a lot like grief. One more loss of an important way of being. And we want to reclaim that way of being. But the amazing thing is, not gathering in person did absolutely nothing to keep us from being a church. That never got put on hold. In many respects, we've done more, we've grown more, we've served others more during this pandemic than before. If anyone had told me a year ago that we would be where we are today, I would have laughed. I might have even said, "That's impossible, you must be dreaming." My mistake was that I was underestimating God's promise for us. So you can bet that church will be different when we reopen because we're already different. We can't go back to the way the world was before COVID. That toothpaste is already out of the tube. Now, for those who want to return to attending church in person, we'll be right back in our familiar surroundings. It'll feel great. Seeing friends you may not have seen in over a year will be simply awesome. But at the same time, it won't be the same because we have dozens of new members and a whole new passel of children who'll be running around. And it's also important to affirm that all of the folks who gather together with us right now on Sundays and during the week online are just as much a part of Salem as anyone who shows up in the flesh. So, we'll have people who show up in person like clockwork every Sunday, and we'll have people who stay home sometimes, and then sometimes they'll appear in person, and we'll have people who engage with us exclusively online, whether they live right here, or they live in Canada, or they live in Texas. We are becoming, and we've already become, a growing local church that also has a very solid and growing online presence. It's a win-win. It's true. Being that kind of church is a new way of thinking about ourselves. But here's the thing. It's already happened. And a ton of churches have been doing this for years, long before any pandemic. So that's not the same either. The world is changing, and we are changing right along with it. The important thing is, all of us will be continuing our journey together. All of us will be affirming the promise that a collection of people from a variety of backgrounds and races and nationalities and places we call home, people who are gay and straight, young and old, can worship and can serve others and learn and find belonging and meaning and purpose in sharing the unlimited love of God that's written on our hearts, and join our individual journeys as one. Because we're people of the promise. With that promise, we can achieve anything. With that promise, we're set free of any limitations, and we will keep on hoping, dreaming, serving, and believing wherever God's promise leads us.